Gastineau.
Rashad, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and that sounds like a long list of accomplishments of a guy who must be getting old. If you're listing all that many.
Yeah, man, I had to bring that up. You know, just off it, icon in Seattle, Washington market, so I had to bring that up. So thanks for coming out. Okay, first question: this book that you have out, what made you want to put this book together?
I moved to Seattle in June of 1991 and began working at KJR, and we were in the process. They were in the process of turning it to an all sports talk radio station, which was still a pretty new concept in 1991. And so I got here in June of 91, and the Huskies that year, they're the first thing I really remember about Seattle, covering them. And you know what it's like. Sometimes when you're covering sports or talking about sports, there are things that happen and you don't realize what's happening until afterwards. But when it's true greatness, when you're watching greatness, I think I've always had the ability to go, well, what I'm seeing right here is special. And I knew that 91 team. See, I got here in June. I started watching them in August. I'm like, these guys are really, really good. Not just championship good. They're one of the best ever, in my opinion at that time, and I still think that 30 years later. So I knew they were a compelling team. I knew they had an incredible amount of talent. They had a lot of great guys. Some teams are really good, and they're not as, for lack of a better term, not as media friendly. You're just not good. Maybe they're not good at being interviewed, or they're shy, or whatever. This team had a ton of characters, a lot of guys who sought out the media and wanted to tell their story. So I figured 30 years later it would be fun to catch up with a lot of those guys, and it was. So that was kind of the genesis for it. I do think, and I'm not from Seattle. I didn't go to the University of Washington. I say this as somebody who observed them. I think they're one of the best teams of all time. Now that's subjective. How do you compare a team from 1990 to a team from today to a team from 1950? But I think in any of those comparisons, you've got to have the 1991 Huskies in the mix. I think they were one of the best college teams ever. I really loved the idea of being the guy who told their story, talking about what they had done and what they accomplished. So that's kind of where it came from.
Yeah, so I just want to go over some of the chapters, not all the chapters. I have your book, I bought it myself. It's a great book, and I just want to go over some of the chapters while you
Sure.
go from chapter. First chapter is A Dark December. Elaborate specific about that first chapter, A Dark December.
It's funny, that was my editor's idea. I should take credit for everything, but I like to give credit where it's due. My editor liked the idea of kind of starting the story in the middle, and I do like that as a writing style. I like jumping around a little bit when you can. You don't want to confuse the reader. But I thought, okay, why don't we start it at what was kind of the low point? Don James got here in 1975, and after 1977, they went to a bowl game every year. It wasn't always the Rose Bowl, but it was usually a pretty big bowl, and it was usually a pretty good bowl. And then, they went to the Orange Bowl in 84, and then they had a couple of years where they went to smaller bowl games, but they were still going to a bowl game. The fans had that experience in December, and this is back when there was only like 18 bowl games. There wasn't that many. Suddenly, 1988 comes. They're 6-5, or 6-5 going into the Apple Cup. I can't remember. But anyway, they lose to Washington State. They blow a big lead in the second half and lose. And they don't go to a bowl game for the first time in 11 years under Don. And that's where we begin it. We begin the story there, the Dark December, where they were all home. I talk about Don and Carol James, his wife, putting up Christmas decorations. They'd never done that in Seattle. They'd always gone to a hotel for Christmas because they were getting ready to play a bowl game somewhere. So I thought that would be an interesting place, and my editor thought that'd be an interesting place to kind of start it, where Don comes in, and what he says to the coaches is, if this happens again next year, we're all going to be looking for a job, and he's probably not too far from the truth. And that's where it kind of begins, where they're starting to redouble their efforts to get back to where they want to be.
Okay, the second chapter, talk about the Orange Bowl. I'll talk about that chapter.
The Orange Bowl is such a fun chapter, a story to write about. So many interesting things happened in that game. I mean, for starters, you had what a lot of people consider the two best teams in the country. Now, BYU ultimately won the national championship, and that was a low point too, because Washington felt as if they had earned at least a share of the title that year by how they played and the way they played Oklahoma. Barry Switzer thought so too. Barry Switzer after the game says, "Listen, that's the best team in the country right there." That's the game where the Conestoga wagon, the Sooner Schooner, goes rolling onto the field and gets a penalty. There was an accident at halftime, a fireworks accident at the halftime show, and several people had to be hospitalized. I don't think anybody was seriously hurt, but it was, it was a big deal. And then one of my favorite things that I did not know, so I went back and maybe I knew it, but I didn't remember it until I started doing the research, was a huge play in that game happens when Oklahoma's kick returner, Buster Rhymes, fumbles a kick. Washington gets it. It really gets him back in the game. It's a real tough point for Rhymes' career at Oklahoma. But now he goes into the NFL after this game and has one of the greatest rookie seasons any guy ever had in the NFL. He has a terrific year. And he gets everybody's attention. Wow, have you seen this return guy? He's really good, Buster Rhymes. And Chuck D is working in L.A. and is working with a young kid. I don't know his name off the top of my head. It's in the book. Working with a young kid and getting him started. And he says, hey, listen, I got an idea. You should change your name to Busta Rhymes. And he took it from Buster Rhymes. So you had in the Orange Bowl a penalty on a Conestoga wagon. You had a fireworks accident. And you had a guy who ends up making a big play, who a music star appropriates his name and becomes one of the best-selling guys of all time. Kind of a lot of neat things going on in that game.
Okay, so third chapter, you talk about recruiter. I'll talk about that chapter.
A real underrated part of Washington's success was a guy named Dick Baird, and Dick had come in as a 38-year-old graduate assistant. Graduate assistants are normally in their 20s. They're like interns. They're not paid. They do all the grunt work. They live together in apartments, and it's basically a graduate assistant. It's exactly what it says. Dick wanted to get into college coaching so bad, and he knew Don, and he said, let me be a graduate assistant. Don said, well, you're 38, and you've got 4 kids. How are you? And he goes, nope, my wife and I have talked about this, and this is what we want to do. So he comes in, he's really good at it. And about that time, the NCAA made a rule that said you had to have a full-time recruiting coordinator. And Dick's strength, and he'd be the first to tell you this, was not coaching football. He was a okay football. His strength was connecting with young people. Don saw that and said, this guy is going to recruiting. So Dick got in there and acquired most of the talent, or was the first step in getting the most of the talent on what would become the 90s.
Fourth chapter, you talk about you need to get Gilbert. Talk about that chapter.
Keith Gilbertson was and is this offensive guru within football. And Keith was one of the first guys, while working for Dennis Erickson, who was in Idaho at the time. They had taken this offense they had seen in a California high school game. It was nicknamed basketball on grass. And it's basically the spread offense that so many teams run today. Well, Keith and Dennis were running it in 1986 at Idaho and winning games and dazzling the Big Sky, putting 4 and 5 guys in the pattern. It was space age. Like, what is this? And Gary Pinkel was the offensive coordinator at Washington, and he saw which way the game was. He said, look, the game's getting more wide open. And Don James saw this too. So they're talking, and Pinkel was secure enough in his job and his talent to say, let's get Keith Gilbertson. What he's doing over at Idaho is terrific. Let's bring him in here and have some elements of that. Keith and Gary worked together for 1 year, and then Gary goes on to Toledo, and then ultimately goes on to Missouri, has terrific success at both places. Keith Gilbertson becomes the offensive coordinator at Washington, and is really the architect of kind of the last piece of the puzzle for Washington becoming nationally dominant, which was an offense that could attack you from a lot of different ways.
Skip 5 because we talk about basketball and grass. Like we just talked about, this is basically basketball and grass element from the spread offense. So I want to skip that chapter and talk about an attacking defense. Chapter 6, talk about that chapter.
Yeah, the defense, Jim Lambright was established by this time as a defensive coordinator, and he had, his 1984 defense that played in that Orange Bowl was nicknamed Purple Rain, and they were great. And they did a few things that he had borrowed from the Chicago Bears' great defense of that same era. And now, by 1988 and 89, he's doing even more things that the Bears had done. And he kept convincing Don that they weren't blitzing enough. So we got to blitz more. Don was kind of an old school, he was a smart guy, don't get me wrong, but Don was an old school conservative coach. Let's be careful, let's run the ball, let's punt the ball well, let's play good, solid defense. We'll wait for the other guy to make a mistake, and then we'll pounce. Jim Lambright was more of a line of, hey, let's really attack these guys. And Jim wanted to blitz on every down, in every situation, at any minute. And they're going through the '89 season, and their defense is struggling. And finally, after a game against Arizona State, where Arizona State beat them, Don and Jim got together, and Don said, I think it's time to try your idea on defense. And they told the players loved it, and they really flipped the switch. And in about week 8 of that season, week 9, they went from being a defense that blitzed in normal blitz situations to a defense that blitzed every time they got the chance, and in any situation. You never knew. They got really good at disguising what they were going to do. So that's kind of what the attacking defense is about.
Next chapter, 1990, talk about that, Chuck.
1990 is a year they should have won the national championship. To be honest, they should have been playing for a second one in 1991. They get rolling in 90, and they're really good. They lose to Colorado early, but they're able to overcome that. And after a wild weekend in college football where they clinched the Pac-10, then the Pac-10, they clinched the Pac-10 championship, going to the Rose Bowl. 6 of the 8 top teams in the country lose on the same Saturday. So that Monday morning, the rankings come out. It's Notre Dame number 1, Washington number 2. And Notre Dame was playing the next week at Tennessee, so everybody assumes they're going to lose. Washington is playing at home against UCLA. UCLA is a very average team. Everybody assumes Washington's going to win, so the talk becomes, well, by next week, Washington is number 1 in the country. And frankly, the players probably got a little fat on themselves that week, and they kind of took their eye off the ball, and UCLA came into Seattle, played a terrific game, had a good game plan, and shocked Washington. And that took them out of any chance to win the championship that year. So the 90 team should have won the championship, and that kind of fuels then what happens in 1991.
Okay, next chapter, we talk about winter, spring, and disaster. We'll talk about that, Chuck.
Yeah, the winter workouts and then into spring football, and the coaches talked about our biggest challenge in 1991 was going to be convincing a group of really great players that they could get better. And they did that by really stoking the fire in practice, really getting after guys, really hounding them to give their best and all that. And they were doing a drill late in the practice in April, in spring ball, and it just got heated. Players are colliding, and coaches love it. They love to see all this work. And 2 of the players got a little carried away, and they hit Mark Brunell, the quarterback, and he wasn't supposed to be touched. It was in a drill where he wasn't supposed to be touched, but they just couldn't pull up. And they hit him and fell on him and injured his knee, severe knee injury. Here's the Rose Bowl MVP, Heisman candidate, terrific quarterback, the guy around whom they built their drive for the title, and he's out for 6 months. He's not going to be able to play until November. That's the disaster part of it. And the backup is a young kid named Billy Joe Hobart, who everybody liked because he had this, a little bit like Joe Namath. He had this really fun attitude towards things. He had a great arm, and he was good, but nobody knew if he was any good. He hadn't played much, and people were like, he's a little immature, he does some silly things. Nobody knew how he was going to be. And him stepping into Brunell's shoes and being sensational is as big a reason as any as to why they won the championship.
Next chapter, interesting chapter, talk about not bad for a 60-point underdog. Talk about that chapter.
They opened the season against Stanford. It was the first time ever the first time in many years that they had opened the year in a conference game. And it was at Stanford. And James was a little bit worried. He always had respect for his opponents. And I don't want to open on the road, open against a good team. And boy, this thing could get derailed right away. And Stanford had a talented offensive lineman named Bob Whitfield, who during the week, for some reason, decided to speak up a little bit and talked about how Stanford wasn't worried about anybody they played. They had respect for Washington, but they felt like they could score as much as they wanted, and said, it wouldn't surprise me if we win this game by 60. And instead, the Huskies come in, and I think the final was 44-7 or 41-7. And after the game, Steve Edmonds, that's not bad for a 60-point underdog. And that was kind of the Huskies saying, listen, man, we're actually pretty good. Don't say anything. Don't give us any bulletin board material. We'll use it. Will turn it against you, and certainly did against Stanford.
Next chapter 10. Talks about 91 NFC delay. That's like a
10, it was the most fun to write probably because it was the game that was the most fun that year. It's what I remember really well. They went out to Nebraska. And this is it. I mean, back in the day when the way things were set up, if you want to win the national championship, you had to win this game. Both teams knew it. Both teams considered themselves championship contenders, and they played a game for the ages. Nebraska dominated for the first 3 quarters, and then late in the third, on a 4th and 8, James decides to go for it. That's the play they call. It works. Gets them some momentum for the first time all night, and they come roaring back and win the game. There's just so many great stories about that game. And both teams had a lot of future NFL stars. Nebraska played well for 3 quarters. Washington played great for the final quarter and beat them. And Washington was already pretty confident that they were really good. But I think that when they came out of Lincoln that night, they knew, and the coaches certainly knew at this point, okay, we got a real shot now. We got to keep these guys on track and keep them improving. Because if we can win this game when we were struggling for 3 quarters and we're at Lincoln and it's a tough place to play, if we can win this, we can win any game we play this year. And so that was a big moment.
This chapter 1 is going to skip 11 chapter. 12 chapter is interesting. Mark Brunell and Billy Joe, you focus on those 2 quarterbacks. Talk about that chapter.
Yeah, so we go back to April, and Brunell is injured, and he's going to be out for 6 months, so Billy Joe's the guy. Well, Brunell was a phenomenal guy at attacking his rehab, and they said, if he was told to do 3 things, he did 5. If he was told to do 5, he would do 7. He wanted to get back. He knew it was going to be a special year. And by the end of September, he is back. But by now, Billy Joe has won at Stanford, and he's won at Nebraska, and the coaches kind of see how the players have reacted to him in practice. So they decide to stay with Billy Joe, and they tell Mark, you're going to be the backup, and they promise him, he said, we're going to get you into games. Don James always believed in playing 2 quarterbacks as much as he could. He felt, look, you're only as strong as your backup quarterback. You've got to get your backup quarterback reps. So they told Mark that. Mark could have chosen to react in a real negative way, and he didn't. He instead reacted in a very positive way and helped Billy Joe as much as he could and was ready whenever they called on him. And Mark's, we see now in the era of transfer portal, and I have nothing against players being able to move. But in that day and age, I'm not sure if Mark wouldn't have jumped into the transfer portal. Instead, he says, I'm going to be the backup, and I'm going to be the best backup I can be. His attitude is a huge reason why the situation worked. He'd come back and kind of sniped at Billy Joe or tried to divide the locker room, which is all stuff that happens in college football. It would have thrown the whole thing off. Instead, he recognized he had something special as Billy, and he chose to be. Mark was the son of a coach. He was going to make that decision, I think, regardless. Kudos to him for doing that.
In the next chapter, we talk about close call at Cal. This is a big game between 2 top 10 teams. Cal versus Washington. Talk about that game. That chapter.
That's probably the forgotten game, and it shouldn't be. It was I said a minute ago the Nebraska game was the best game, and I loved the Nebraska game. The Cal game was spectacular, and Cal at the end of the game is throwing the ball in the end zone, trying to tie the game up. It was another one that was kind of a slugfest. Cal played really well. The Washington players all told me 30 years later that they never felt like they were in any danger at Cal. But I think that's what we see so often with great athletes. It's kind of for lack of a better word, they develop an arrogance toward things. I don't mean that as negative. It's almost positive. Like, man, we weren't in any trouble there. We were going to win that. They were in trouble at Cal. They definitely had some things that could have screwed them up, but they didn't. Again, they found a way and they stayed steady and find a way to win. Cal was very good that year. Cal went on and just destroyed Clemson in the Gator Bowl. That's a good Cal team. And what Cal fans will tell you is, what if Sean Dawkins doesn't get injured? Sean Dawkins was wide receiver for Cal, goes on to a great NFL career, suffers a Charlie horse, and has to sit out the whole second half. What's that? What's the difference to having him out? Might have been huge, might have been everything, but that's part of the deal. You got to overcome that stuff, and that was too much for him.
Next chapter, we talk about defense. Interesting concept. That chapter, talk about elaborate on that chapter.
Yeah, the defense and the we fence was a story that Keith Gilbertson told me. Don James, from his roots, was a defensive coach. He'd come up as a defensive coach. He'd been a defensive coordinator. He was a coordinator of Michigan. He was a coordinator of Colorado. He was a defensive-minded guy. Gilby was the offensive coordinator. Now Don had a defensive coordinator named Jim Lambright. Jim and Don would talk about defense all the time. Don knew what the offense was doing, but he didn't pay as much attention to it. He kind of trusted Gilbertson and Gary Finkel to run the offense. So Gilby said that he nicknamed it the wee fence and the U fence because Don would come in for their morning meetings and he would refer to his defense and say, "We're going to do this today in practice. We're working on this in practice. This is what we think is going to happen in the game." And then he turned to Gilby and said, "What are you doing?" So he said, "All right, well, I'm running the U fence and you've got the wee fence over there." It's a very funny line, but also kind of explains one of the great things about Don, which is Don was an old style tower coach. He got that from Bear Bryant. He wanted to coach up in the tower and watch practice from high above. He had to get good guys to work for him, and he had to trust them. He allowed them to do most of the hands-on coaching. He would volley in thoughts from the tower, and then certainly in meetings he was very expressive. But Don trusted his lieutenants, and he trusted Gilby with that offense. So hence the defense.
Okay, well, next chapter. Talk about beating history. So you talk about that chapter.
As they get into the season more and they're moving along, part of what was going on was they had to keep these guys focused on getting better. I think I mentioned that earlier, and they had to somehow convince them that you can't just walk in and they kept going back to the UCLA game a year earlier. What happens when you don't take an opponent seriously? Well, they were taking their next opponent seriously. Beating history is all about going down to Los Angeles and playing USC. On paper, Washington was much better than USC this year. But no matter what, in the history of the Pac-8, the Pac-10, and the Pac-12, when you play at USC, you're playing in history. You're playing in that old Coliseum. You're playing against the horse. You're playing against all the ghosts of the past. So it doesn't, USC has had great years and they've had not so great years, and they're really at a low ebb right now. But it's still hard to go in. It's a sneaky place to play. And they went into USC. This is the game that probably worried James the most. He knew. And he had not had great success in Los Angeles against USC. They go in, they don't play their best game, but they win. And they kind of dominate. You guys nothing, but they kind of dominated USC. Because he didn't do a whole lot, but they hung around all day. But in the end, and this is also the game where they kind of start focusing on what's going to happen. Now that they all know that they're getting close to getting to history. So that's what beating history is all about.
And next chapter, we talk about hungrier than ever. We'll talk about that chapter.
Hungrier than ever refers to them wanting to get back to the Rose Bowl, which they do by beating Oregon State, but not celebrating it at all. The year before, they had beaten Arizona. They had celebrated going back to the Rose Bowl, and parties, and then they lose to UCLA the next year. They beat Oregon State. They're going to the Rose Bowl. There was hardly a reaction in the locker room. They didn't want anybody from Pasadena to present them with the official invitation, which was tradition back then. And instead, they just said, "No, we got to get ready for Washington State. The Rose Bowl means nothing. We've got to go beat Washington State. Then we can focus on the Rose Bowl." So that's what hungrier than ever referred to. That was that team's motto that year, too. So I thought you guys could do that.
Chapter 18, we talk about the weak. Discuss about that chapter.
The weak link was a phrase used by Bob Greasy in one of the games. Bob was an ABC TV analyst, former Dolphins quarterback. Of course, his son is on Monday Night Football now. Bob was Keith Jackson's analyst, and he was talking about Washington's team and how strong they were. And he said, and he didn't mean this as a negative, and the guy it was aimed at didn't take it as a negative. It was funny. Everybody had a lot of fun with it. He referred to Billy Joe Hobart as the weak link. And he said, and the reason I say that is because he's a sophomore, he's still kind of inexperienced. Their defense is loaded with veterans. The rest of their offense is loaded with veterans. If they have a weak link, it's probably a quarterback. Billy said, "Hey, he's a quarterback. He knows. I don't take any offense to that." But one of Billy's friends immediately got bumper stickers made up that said the weak link. And the players, of course, Billy Joe's teammate, just hammered him. He really had a lot of fun at his expense. You're the weak link. it became a little rallying cry for them, but it was not meant to be an insult by Bob Greasy, and it wasn't taken as such by Billy Joe. It was taken, I think, in the spirit that Billy Joe said, if I'm the weak link, we're in pretty good shape. And he's absolutely right.
Next chapter, talk about We Fear No Man. I'll talk about that chapter.
Yeah, that's in a Rose Bowl meeting a few nights before the Rose Bowl, and the defensive coaches had put together a sizzle reel, if you will, a highlight reel of Desmond Howard of Michigan, Heisman Trophy. They told the defensive guys, listen, you need to know what we're dealing with. We can talk bravado all we want. This guy's really good, and here's how good he is. So they showed about a 5-minute video of how all the stuff he had done this season. And it was meant to focus the defense. Say, look, this is what you're dealing with. Don't take this guy lightly. And they turned the lights up, and before Lambright started speaking, Dana Hall, the great secondary player, the quarterback, says, Coach, we fear no man. And that had been another phrase they had used before, and the players all started kind of howling. And it was kind of their way of telling the coach, we know he's good, but we didn't get here by being intimidated or scared of anybody. We fear no man. And the second I heard that story, I knew I had a title for the book.
All right, next chapter, Purple Shirt.
Yeah, that's a phrase Keith Gilbertson used, and I thought it was a good title for the Rose Bowl. They really did put the purple shirt hurt on Michigan. And Michigan was a good team. Michigan had a lot of really good players, guys that would go on to play on Sunday, and Michigan would come back and win the Rose Bowl over Washington the very next year. So I mean, this was not a bad team. Washington just dominated. Took most of the first half to get going, but the game was never really in doubt. Steve Entman, such a bell cow for this team. He was dominant that day, and Billy Joe had a pretty good day, and their tight ends all had good days. Just everything worked for them. The game was never in doubt. It was 34-14 was the final. It could have been 41 or maybe 48. They were really dominant.
Next chapter, no champions, obviously. Won the Shield National Championship. Miami Hurricanes at that time. Talk about that chapter, being national champions.
We tell the story, and again, people might not remember this, or if they do, and there was something about it that was kind of fun. I prefer a playoff. I like the cut and dried nature of a playoff. It used to be that Miami goes into the Orange Bowl, they beat Nebraska, they're 12-0. Washington's in the Rose Bowl, they beat Michigan, they're 12-0. Okay, everybody, go to bed, and tomorrow morning we'll announce the votes. So everybody had to, Washington was convinced they were going to win at least a share of the title, and I think Miami was too. Nobody knew until about 7 o'clock the next morning. That's kind of what that chapter's about, is the unbelievable anxiousness of waiting to hear. You've done everything you can do. Imagine that if for some reason there was like a sporting event where, okay, we're all done, now we're going to wait 12 hours to tell you who the actual champion is. That's what that was about, was kind of going through that waiting on that.
Next chapter, Team Perfection. Talk about that chapter.
Team perfection was a phrase that a writer named Don Horst had coined for this team. And I just kind of talk about them in the scheme of history. And as I said off the top, it's hard to, how do you compare different eras? It's awfully difficult to do. But it was my desire to kind of bring the book to a close, to write about the history of this team and how I think they could have competed in any era. And I think, and most of the times when you see a ranking of the greatest teams ever, I think ESPN did a ranking, and I think Washington's 91 team was ranked 21st, just the 21st greatest team of all time. 10 of the teams ahead of them were teams that played in the 30s, and I don't mean to be dismissive of that, the 30s and the 40s, but I mean, that was a different style of football. It was completely different from what we see today. So if you talk about a modern era, if you want to start the modern era in about 1960 or 1955, Washington would be considered one of the 10 best teams ever. So I wrote about that, why I think they would have beaten Miami, and what would happen if that game played. So it's, that it kind of sums up their whole story.
Last chapter, talk about his history.
Yeah, I get into coaching trees, and I draw a line, and it's very easy. It's a direct line from the guy that, at least by championships won, is considered the greatest coach of all time, Nick Saban. Well, Nick played for Don James at Kent State. Don was the coach at Kent State in the early 70s. Nick, as he writes in the foreword for the book, got done with football and wanted to move back to West Virginia. He had a business degree. His dad had been in the automobile business, and Nick saw himself as going in, getting control of these dealerships. He's going to be a successful businessman and own car dealerships and make a lot of money, and that's going to be his life, and it's going to be great. And Don says, listen, Don thought Nick was as smart a guy as he'd ever coached. He got what they were doing, understood what they were doing, why they were doing it. And so he says, look, I think you should be coaching and try to do a graduate assistant thing for a year. Your fiance has got a year left in her schooling. Let her stay here. Let's get her graduated. You do a year with me, see if you like it. And at the end of the year, if you don't like it, you can go get in the automobile business, and you and Terry can go get married and have a great life. And as Nick says, it was the best decision he ever had to be talked into. I mean, all these years later, he's considered the greatest, one of the greatest, I think the greatest ever. And all happened because Don James kind of recognized something. So that coaching tree thing that kind of winds through college football really impacted both teams because they both worked for a lot of them.
So you said that Washington would beat Miami. Simulate that game and play each other in the field. What would be the final score if Miami played Washington at that time in 1992, like in January of the 91 season?
Yeah, great question. How I see the game unfold, and maybe the best thing to do is go to the late Dick Tolman. Dick, great coach at Arizona for all these years. He played both teams. Arizona played Miami, and they played Washington that same year in '91. He says Washington would have won a close game. He believes it would have been close. Don James always believed it would have been a close game, and Dennis Erickson, who was kind enough to talk to me for the book, he thinks it would have been close. Not surprisingly, he thinks his guys would have won Miami. Look, it was two 12-0 teams. Any comparison you make can be countered with a different one. I think Washington would have won. I'm not sure how close I think it would have been. I don't think it would have been a blowout. But Washington was really good at pressuring the quarterback. Miami was not great at protecting Gino Torretta. Gino was a lot of things. A former future Heisman Trophy winner, and he had a rocket for an arm. It wasn't real mobile. I think Washington would have gotten a lot of pressure on Gino Torretta. Miami was not great at stopping the run. Washington was a really good running team. Miami had given up tons of yards. They gave up their last game of the year. They gave up 200 and some odd yards to San Diego State. Now, to be fair to Miami, San Diego State had a young kid named Marshall Faulk running for him back here, and he had a pretty good day. But the point being, they had trouble stopping the run. Washington was really good at running the football. And Miami, and as much as they had made this an emphasis in 1991 that they weren't good at, Miami was Miami, man. They were loud, and they were brash, and they were in your face, and they therefore had a lot of 15-yard penalties, unsportsmanlike conduct penalties, and especially in the last 3 games of the year, they seem to really kind of get their legs under them, and they start doing this. Washington was not a pure team by any stretch of the imagination. Most good teams do push the envelope and do get penalties. But Miami had almost twice as many penalties called per game as Washington. And in a championship level game, that might be. As I said to Dennis Erickson, for everything I list about his great Miami team perceived as a negative, it can be answered by a Miami guy going, yeah, and we were 12-0. And so they won every game they played. They were a great football team. I think Washington was a better football team. We'll never know. Billy Joe Holbert gave me a great quote in the book. Man, if I had one more game I could play, even today, it'd be Miami. I mean, the players involved on both sides have always said they'd love to play that game.
Okay, so where can people find your book, and where can they contact you, to find your book, stuff like that, give information about where you can find your book?
Yeah, it's available. If you do a Fear No Man and my name, Mike Gastineau, if you do a search, you'll find a couple of different links to stores. It's available through Amazon, which is probably the easiest way for most people to get it. You can get it off the Amazon site. It's available anywhere you get books. If you go to a bookstore, they'll be able to find it and order it for you. And it's obviously a book. I did a good job, I believe, not writing this as a cheerleader. If you pick it up, it's not dripping with purple and gold Washington love. Now, I did love that team, and I did write about it. But I think any football fan would enjoy reading this and enjoy getting a chance to learn about this team. Because they are one of the best. There's no argument about that. I don't know if it's the best, but they're right in there. And in Steve Emtman, they have one of the greatest players ever. And Billy Joe Holbert, they had a quarterback who was a college Carter, and they had Don James, who is, in some ways, because he coached up here in Seattle a little off the beaten path, a very underrated coach. He had the one national championship. I talked to Nick Saban about this. Nick's got 7 or 8 now. And I said in every season there's 1 or 2 games where you have to get a little lucky to keep the run going. And Nick said, you're absolutely right. We win championships. We win them because we have 1 or 2. And Don had that opposite side of it. He had 3 or 4 other seasons where 1 or 2 plays in 1 game prevented him from having a chance to win a championship. So he could have very easily had 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 titles. But he had 1. That's how it goes. And I liked writing this because I knew Don really well, and he passed, 8 years ago now. I wanted to make sure his legacy, he doesn't need me to help his legacy, but I love talking about him and making sure people know about him. He sure was good at his job.
Yeah, man, thanks for coming on the show, Mike Gastineau. It's been a pleasure. Best success with your book.
And the same to you. I've done 5 books, and you've darn near killed me. How many have you done? Is he 42, 48? I mean,
Yeah.
Now you're just showing off, man. You're doing so many books, you're making me look bad.
Oh, how you know that? How you found that out? Nah, I'm serious. I know you knew to have wrote books. I know.
Yeah, I know you've done a lot of writing, and I admire anybody who's prolific because it is a tough, hard, solitary gig. And I appreciate getting a chance to come on and talk so much about the book. I hope you and your listeners enjoy it. It's great being on the show.
Thank you, man. Thanks for coming on the show. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So long.
All right. That's Mike Gastineau.